Hello everybody. So I'm inspired to share. I've had the thought of free will and choice come into my mind a few times this week. I've had a couple of conversations and I've posted a video that suggests that there is no free will or choice. And needless to say, I've had a few comments and questions. For example, why then would A Course in Miracles use the idea or concept of choice as a means of helping us to awaken, if in fact choice and free will is not a reality? So in this joining, in this conversation or exploration, the aim is to answer the question, is there free will and choice? And look at the benefit of exploring choices and exploring how decision making has and does unfold in our experience. And if there's any value in decision making and believing in choice or power in choice. So first, we have to define or agree on the definition of free will and choice before we can conclusively recognize its reality or its illusory nature. And free will is defined, the textbook definition of free will is personal and independent choice. And choice is basically the ability to decide on an option. So free will and choice is simply the personal and independent ability to decide on an option. And with that in mind, there has to be a few elements in place. The first thing is there has to be a person. We can't even talk about a person having free will and choice if there is no person. So there has to be a person to have and claim free will and choice. The second thing is there has to be independence or independent power to act in isolation, to decide on something. There has to be an independent or separate, or an opportunity to separately decide without any imposed influences. So, for example, if I was on a pirate ship and asked to walk off on the plank and jump into the water while someone held a pitchfork or a gun, we can say that that is an imposed influence. So in order for free will and choice to be a reality, there can be no imposed influences. And of course, the example that I used was a very extreme example of imposed influences. And then lastly, there has to be options, right? So if there's no options, then can we really say that there's a choice being made? So person, independent power, and choice, or options to be able to make a choice. Now, if we set that aside for a moment and we just look at where the teachings of A Course in Miracles or the teachings of non-duality or many Eastern philosophies, where they point to, A Course in Miracles says, regardless of the teacher, regardless of the teaching, the curricula is the same, which is know thyself, which infers that we don't know ourselves. So if we're suffering and in pain, it's because we don't know ourselves. We take ourselves to be something that we're not. Ultimately, what the Course and non-dual teachings and much of Eastern philosophy, and I'm sure there's many other religions and forms of these spiritual teachings that agree to or lead to this idea that there's no separate self. There is no separate self-concept. That's real. There's no ego. That's real. Although the ego comes into appearance, the self-concept comes into appearance, the spiritual teaching or law is that there are no separate parts, so there is no person. The other thing spiritual teachings would point to is that there's only one source. There's only one God. That's it. There aren't multiple sources, and there could not be source separate from source. In other words, if we take for a moment in consideration all that there is, everything that exists, there's nothing outside of everything that exists that can act independent of everything that exists. So there's only one We are one is what all spiritual teachings would teach. We are one, we are connected. It is impossible for part of the whole to actualize itself separate from the whole. To do so would be to usurp God. That is what we believe we've done. Hence, we believed ourselves to be a separate self-concept. And so we believed ourselves to have separated or usurped the power of God, when in fact that is an impossibility. And then lastly, A Course in Miracles says that only love is real. Only love is real. Everything else is perceptual or is illusion. And perception is illusion on the basis that perception isn't stable and perception is dependent upon interpretation and it cannot be counted on. And so, in truth, what we want to come to know and what spiritual teachings lead us to is that there's only love. There's only love, and that's all that's ever been and all that ever will be. So now we look at that and we compare it to what's needed to be able to confirm the idea of free will and choice. Well, we don't have a person. Spiritual truths tell us there's no separate person. Spiritual truths tell us there's nothing independent or separate from source. There's no outside independent source separate from the source that is source of everything. And then lastly, only love is real. Everything else is illusion. So you can't make a decision if there's only one thing that's real. So we can say that the teachings of A Course in Miracles and that of non-duality point to the recognition and the realization that there is no free will and choice. However, what tends to happen is the mind can perceptually understand that, or can have a perception or an idea or an understanding, if you will, of where spiritual teachings lead to, and can see how in reality with the capital R there is no free will. Being what it is, this thought system of separation, it wants to also claim that it can know that there's no choice. And so it's possible that this thought system would think along the lines of, well, if there's no free will and choice, then what's the point of anything? Why do A Course in Miracles? Why meditate? Why pray? And that's just furthering the delusion, or furthering or wasting time, or spiritually bypassing and spiritually ghosting. Because although there is no free will and choice, if we take ourselves to be a separate self-concept and still having an experience of separation, then choice and decision-making is still happening in our experience. And so to deny it would be delusional. And the Course does use the idea of choice as a means to awaken us. Even though ultimately where it's leading us to is the recognition that there's never been a choice. If we look at our experience, we will recognize that we use choice as a way to define who and what we are. So many of us may identify with this idea that I am who I am today because of the choices that I've made, or I am in the situation that I'm in because of the choices that I've made. This appears very logical. But it would be reason that will help integrate this idea of no choice. And reason would tell me that in every situation that I claim choice, I'm claiming it after it happens. So, for example, the other day my partner woke up or came out to the living room and he was shivering. He's like, "Why is it so cold in here?" And then he noticed that the door had been left open. He said, "Who left the door open?" "Oh, I left the door open. I left the door open." Seems logical. I was the last one who came in. I left the door open. It wasn't him. It had to be me. But did I decide to leave it open? No. In fact, leaving it open or closing it was never in awareness as it was unfolding. But the mind that is perpetuating this idea of separation seems to automatically claim choices upon reflection. So I chose, in the mind that says I left the door open, I was the one who made the choice. And that belief can also bring about a sense of guilt, because in that belief, I'm the one responsible, I'm the one that's guilty, and now I'm the one that has to pay the price because I am the one that left the door open. And that holds true with all decisions. It's always upon reflection. So I may look back and think, I chose to go to university. I chose to study theater. I chose to be in a relationship after I graduated from college. I chose to get a job in retail. I chose to move to California. I chose to create a career in retail and eventually leave LA to come to Hawaii. And of course, there's a mixture of decisions that have filled the gaps in between. And I say that only upon reflection of myself, the self-concept, which is always an image held in mind, including our body, which is simply just another image happening in the mind that's dreaming it up. So upon reflection of that, I'm looking on the timeline, I can say all of that. And that is all being said, again, to define the self-concept. But if I was to be honest, and to the best of my ability, step back, I would recognize that there's a lot that actually unfolded and happened. There's content there, always content, that is somehow being minimized or ignored in order to come into the conclusion that I was the one who made those decisions and choices. When in reality, when I went to college, first of all, the decision to go to college really wasn't my decision. My mom would not have had it another way. I had to go to college. There was no choice in that. So there's definitely no free will in that situation. I had no choice. I was going to be an architect. That was the choice I made, to be an architect. And shortly after being in the program, I had a lot of resistance to the program. I hated it. I didn't enjoy it, and so forth. And I had this uncontrollable love and yearning for the theater and the arts. And I enjoyed this idea of being creative, not to mention the idea of potentially becoming famous and being an actor. That was an imposed influence on the decision to join the theater department. There was already a proclivity, and there was an attitude and mental state in the moment that all was unfolding that contributed to the decisions that were seemingly made at that time. So there were these imposed influences, which makes sense because not being separate from all things and all things being part of me, of course, that is the way that grace was being worked through me. And so I joined the theater department. I eventually would get a job afterwards in retail, and that was an accident. I certainly didn't, I never imagined myself with a career in retail. Not something I decided. I fell in love. Again, not something I decided. It's like 2 or 3 months into it, and he's living with me, and we're picking out China patterns. How did that happen? I didn't do that. Yes, there were decisions and choices being made. Do we go with Wedgwood, or do we go with Jaliska? Who knows? Those pattern choices. But all of that is unfolding. It is in the moment of what's happening. I'm merged with what's happening. I am what's happening itself. And through hindsight is where I can claim ownership of the decisions. And so that is basically how life unfolds. And when we can see that, the benefit of recognizing that in fact there's no free will and choice is then there's a release and a relief of the guilt that we carry for the choices we made. We've all heard this before, that we can only make choices based upon where, what's in our awareness at the moment in time that we're making those choices. We can't choose to have something in our awareness that's not there if it's not there. And when we're making these choices, the thought for the choice is either in mind or not. And the thought that appears in mind, we can't choose. Really, when we start to investigate this, and I'm not asking anybody to believe what I'm saying, I'm asking you to decide for yourself as your life is unfolding and what the benefit is for you. But in my experience, I know that there's a lot of logical decisions I could or should have made. Use the simple example of eating at a restaurant. I know it's, from a logical standpoint, I should be eating the vegetables, not the French fries. But for some reason, I get the French fries, and then afterwards there's this sense of, what did I do? But that's all a trick of the mind to create a self-concept, to create an experience of separation, of guilt, and also to project guilt. Because if we believe that we have choice and that we can be guilty, then we believe other people can be guilty as well. And that's really the beauty of forgiveness, because when we recognize or forgive others and recognize that there really wasn't a choice, then we realize in our own experience there really wasn't a choice. And so we are forgiven as we forgive others. And the Course, or Course in Miracles, uses this idea of choice, because as long as we believe ourselves to be separate and living in a world in which we are in charge of our life, then there are going to be choices. And what does the Course do? In its brilliance, the Course says, when you're going to make a choice, make it with the Holy Spirit. So you're going to make it with the wholeness. That is what the Holy Spirit is, the wholeness of all things. You're going to make a decision out of love, or with love. What does that mean? We are making decisions with what is all-encompassing. And so there's this constant repetition of decision making with the wholeness of what's happening. So in other words, this personal interest is withdrawn so that we can decide with the movement of everything, not for the purpose of necessarily making a better decision, but for the purpose of recognizing that we are incapable of making a decision. That all decisions and everything as it unfolds is unfolding by the grace of God. And in fact, we don't have to put effort to earn our worthiness in this world. We don't have to put effort into establishing our invulnerability. All of that is already established, but we cannot come into awareness of that until we withdraw from the ways that we keep ourselves separate. So the Course, in asking us to use the power of our decision to choose alongside the Holy Spirit, is really sort of tricking the mind into witnessing really what's happening. That's why I've heard teachers use this idea of pause for inspiration. So what happens when we pause? We stop the mental commentary and allow grace. We allow the nothingness that is to lead the way of what's to happen. And then in that example, in those examples, we recognize that everything is given. And that's what we want to come into the awareness of. We want to recognize that we don't have to make our lives, that our lives and everything about life is given to us, and that we are cared for, and that we are one. Spiritual teachings lead to the idea that we are not a separate person, and we're not who we are. All that really means is that we're not who we are in our thoughts. It's not to say that this isn't happening. It is happening, but it's not because this, whatever this is that's happening, that I have to impose this self-concept or idea of myself in what's happening. I can allow what's happening to be. I can allow everything to be, and in it I'm allowed to be, and I can experience my wholeness and my connectedness to everything, and my invulnerability, being connected to everything. There's nothing that can harm me. And we want that recognition. We want to come into that recognition. And we want to come into the recognition that life is easy. I always enjoy looking at these images of birds in a flock. You have this flock of birds, and there may be hundreds, if not even, maybe thousands of birds, and they're all moving as one organism. They split, they come together, but they're all moving as one organism. From a distance, it looks like one organism, but when you get close, you see all these birds. You may have the same experience watching a school of fish. They're all kind of all together. They split, they come together. Yet there's hundreds of fish. But each fish is not acting independently of the whole. It's all one movement working together. There's not thousands of decisions to go left or right, or there would be chaos. And so that is basically symbolic of the entire universe. The entire universe is one movement. And we are part of that movement with it all. We are it all. And so even in our attempt to spiritually awaken, the cosmos are in support and with us. In our attempt to use choice for the purpose of awakening, by choosing with the Holy Spirit, by choosing love over fear, the entire cosmos is supporting that decision, and that effort is all there to help us. So from this perspective, we can welcome in choice as it shows up and be excited. I'm using choice for the purpose of awakening, and I'm doing so with the entire cosmos. You are everything.